3 days before my son's retirement celebration, I drove to the Maple Ridge Community Hall to confirm the catering order. Margaret Ellison, who had managed that hall for nearly 30 years, met me at the door before I could even knock. She looked at me the way people look at someone standing too close to the edge of something dangerous. "Come inside," she said quietly. "Not through the front. Use the side door." I didn't understand. Margaret and I had known each other since our children were in the same elementary school class in Kelowna. She was not a dramatic woman. She was the kind of woman who kept spare pens in her apron pocket and remembered everyone's coffee order. If she was pulling me through a side door, something was very wrong. She led me through the kitchen corridor and into her small office at the back. She closed the door. She didn't turn on the light. The only sound was the hum of the refrigeration units on the other side of the wall. Just barely. Voices from the event room next to us. "A private meeting," she whispered. "They booked it this morning. Last minute." I recognized the voice. I held my breath. A man's voice. Smooth and unhurried. The transfer has to happen before the celebration. Once she's surrounded by family and distracted, she won't look at the documents carefully. She'll sign because she trusts him. A woman's voice. Younger, and the notary he's confirmed. He'll be there Saturday evening. The man again. The power of attorney gives us full authority over the property and the registered accounts. Once it's activated, we move within the week. I pressed my back against the wall. The property, the registered accounts, they were talking about me. I was certain of it. A third voice. Male. Careful and measured. I've prepared the assessment. Mild but progressive cognitive concerns. Entirely credible for her age. Nothing that invites scrutiny. Just enough to justify a substitute decision-maker. My stomach turned to stone. Margaret's hand found my arm in the dark and held on. Outside. Chairs scraped across the floor. Footsteps. A door. Then silence. She turned on the light. Her eyes were red. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know whether to call you or wait. I didn't know if I was doing the right thing." I told her she was. I walked out to my car and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The Okanagan Valley was golden that afternoon. The lake flat and silver at the bottom of the hill. My son Daniel would turn 65 on Saturday. 37 years I had worked alongside his father. Built the business. Raised Daniel through seasons that were sometimes brutal and sometimes beautiful. And now someone was planning to take everything I had left. In 3 days, I am 68 years old. My name is Eleanor Hartwell. And I have learned that the most dangerous people in your life are not strangers. They are the ones who know exactly where you keep your trust. My husband Robert passed away 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Swift and merciless. He was 67. We had built Hartwell Property Management together over 32 years, starting with a single rental property in the North Okanagan and growing it into a portfolio of 11 residential buildings, a small commercial block on Bernard Avenue, and a trust account that we had protected through 2 recessions and 1 very bad flood year. When Robert died, I did not sell. I did not retreat. He sat at his desk, learned every file, every lease, every insurance renewal, and I kept going. Our daughter-in-law Sandra once said, in what I think she meant as a compliment, that I was made of something harder than ordinary people. I took it as a compliment then. I am less sure now. Daniel was our only child. He had worked in the business since he was 23, starting in maintenance and learning every floor of it the way his father had intended. By the time Robert died, Daniel was running day-to-day operations. I remained the majority shareholder and the named beneficiary of the Morrison Hartwell Family Trust, which held the bulk of the estate. The total value between the properties, the accounts, and the trust was somewhere north of $3 million. Not extraordinary by some measures. Everything by ours. Daniel married Sandra in 2007. She was a project manager from Calgary, organized and capable, and I had been glad of her. At first, after Robert died, things changed in ways I only understood slowly. There were small moments. Sandra suggesting I might want to step back from active management, that the stress wasn't good for a woman my age. Daniel going quiet when I disagreed, with a decision in a board meeting we held at my kitchen table. A comment from Sandra in November. Eleanor, you mentioned that same tenant complaint twice this week. Did you realize? I hadn't realized. Or perhaps I had and forgotten. I was 68 and grieving and managing 11 buildings. I started doubting myself. I did not know yet that the doubt was being planted. I sat in the parking lot of the community hall and stared at the lake until my hands stopped shaking. Then I called Patricia Okafor. Patricia was my solicitor. We had worked together for 14 years. First, on the business. Then on Robert's estate. She was one of those rare lawyers who treated your problem as if it were actually her problem, which made her expensive and entirely worth it. She picked up on the second ring. I need you tonight. I said, something is happening, and I don't have much time. She met me at her office on Water Street at 6:30. I told her everything, the voices through the wall, the power of attorney, the word assessment, the reference to my age. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was very still for a moment. Then she said, who else was in that room? I told her I'd recognize the man's voice. It was Gareth Moss. He was an estate planner Daniel had brought into our business conversations the previous spring. Pleasant, professional seeming, referral from Sandra's brother. I had found him slightly too smooth and dismissed the feeling as uncharitable. Patricia pulled up her laptop. I've heard the name, she said. Let me make some calls. She also wrote down a number and pushed it across the desk. Call him tonight, she said. His name is Frank Belanger. He's a former RCMP financial crimes investigator. I've used him twice. He's thorough, and he doesn't leak. I called Frank from the parking garage. He answered before the second ring with a voice that sounded like it had heard worse things than whatever I was about to tell him. I told him everything. He said he needed 48 hours. He asked for access to our business bank records through Patricia's office. He asked about the third voice, the one discussing the assessment. I think it was Dr. Warren. I said, Neil Warren. He's been my family physician for 6 years. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, all right. That's a thread. I'll start pulling it tonight. I drove home to my house on Lakeshore Road. The house Robert and I had bought in 1998 when we finally allowed ourselves the luxury. I stood in the kitchen and made tea I didn't drink. On the refrigerator, a photograph Daniel and me at Robert's grave on the first anniversary of his death. We were both crying. I had thought we were crying together. I didn't sleep. I lay on top of the covers in the dark and tried to think clearly. The retirement celebration was in 3 days. Saturday evening. If the power of attorney was meant to be signed that night, I had approximately 72 hours to understand what was happening and stop it. I thought about the previous spring. Gareth Moss had appeared in April. Introduced over dinner at Daniel and Sandra's house in West Kelowna. He had talked about estate planning with the easy fluency of someone who had said these words 1,000 times. He mentioned a tool called a representation agreement, common in British Columbia, which allowed a person to designate someone to make financial decisions on their behalf if they became incapable. He looked at me while he explained it. "Just something to consider," he said. "For peace of mind." I had said I would think about it. In June, Daniel came to my office and said that Sandra was worried about me. He said that I had been under enormous stress since his father died, that the business was a lot for one person, that perhaps I should allow him to take on more formal authority. I told him the business was running well. He nodded and dropped the subject. In August, I missed a meeting with a property inspector. My assistant had put it in the wrong column of the shared calendar. Sandra brought it up at Sunday dinner. "These things happen," she said, gently, and then looked at Daniel in a way that said the opposite. In October, I had a conversation with Dr. Warren about fatigue and occasional difficulty sleeping. He had been my doctor since Robert's diagnosis. I had trusted him with the worst year of my life. He listened carefully, nodded, and said he wanted to do a few routine assessments. Memory and cognition, standard for our age group. I had not thought anything of it. Now I understood. Frank Belanger called me at 6 the next morning. I was already sitting in the kitchen. His voice was calm, the way still water is calm, with weight underneath it. "3 things," he said. "You'll want to be sitting down." I told him I was. The first Gareth Moss had done this before. Not in British Columbia. He had operated in Ontario in 2019. Same method. An elderly widow in Ottawa. A representation agreement activated on the basis of a physician's cognitive assessment. Full authority over a registered investment account worth approximately $800,000 transferred to a named beneficiary who was subsequently found to have a pre-existing financial relationship with Moss. The case was settled. Records were sealed. Moss had moved west. The second, Gareth Moss and Sandra Hartwell, had a shared numbered company registered in Alberta. It had been created in February. 2 months before Moss appeared at the dinner table. The company was called 4771 Okanagan Holdings. It listed 2 directors. Sandra was one of them. The third, Frank, had verified the dates from my calendar and cross-referenced them with the board meeting transcripts my assistant had kept. Every incident cited as evidence of my cognitive decline. The missed meeting. The repeated tenant complaint. The confusion over a lease renewal date. Each one had a documented alternative explanation. Wrong calendar entry. A building manager who had in fact raised the same issue twice. A lease amendment that had genuinely been revised. None of it was accurate, but Dr. Warren had documented all of it. I called Patricia. She listened to everything Frank had found. Then she said, "I'm filing for an emergency court order to freeze the family trust accounts this morning. Judge availability in Kelowna is tight. But I know someone in Penticton. Can you be there by noon?" I was there by 11:30. The judge reviewed Patricia's materials for 40 minutes. The order was granted. All assets held under the Morrison Hartwell Family Trust were frozen pending investigation. The order would remain sealed until Saturday evening at 9 o'clock. When Patricia would activate it, any attempt to execute a power of attorney or representation agreement in the intervening period would be automatically void. We had one more problem. Frank needed more time to build a complete evidentiary record. The financial transfers, the paper trail between Moss and Sandra, the connection to Dr. Warren. It was all there. But assembling it properly required the full 48 hours he had originally asked for. Saturday was still happening. Patricia looked at me across the table in the courthouse parking lot. "You could cancel the event," she said. "Do this quietly. Stop it before it starts." I thought about that for a long time. Then I said no. I want to know who else knew. And I want Daniel to hear it in a room he can't walk away from. Patricia nodded slowly. "Then we do it at the celebration." I spent Friday the way you spend the hours before something terrible and necessary. I organized everything I owned. I reviewed the trust documents, the property deeds, the insurance policies, the lease agreements, all of it. I updated my emergency contact information with my bank. I called my sister in Victoria and talked about nothing important for 45 minutes and was grateful for every second of it. Margaret Ellison came to my house Friday afternoon. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me she was sorry she hadn't called me sooner. That she'd heard Moss and Sandra in that room 2 weeks ago the first time. That she'd been trying to decide what to do ever since. I poured her tea and told her she had done enough. I told her what I needed from her for the next evening. She agreed to everything. That night, Frank sent me 4 folders by secure email. Red, blue, green, yellow. Patricia and I went through them together in my living room. The red folder, Gareth Moss. Beyond the Ottawa case. Frank had found a second matter in Manitoba. 2021, an 81-year-old retired school teacher in Winnipeg. A representation agreement. A fabricated physician's assessment. Approximately $340,000 in RRIFs and a TFSA transferred to a nephew who had retained Moss's services 6 weeks prior. The teacher was placed in a long-term care facility in 2022. She had passed away in March of that year. Her daughter was still pursuing a civil claim. The blue folder, Sandra Hartwell. The Alberta Numbered Company held a bank account in Calgary. 14 months of statements showed deposits from a numbered Ontario corporation linked to Moss's previous operation and a series of wire transfers totaling $212,000. A contract, unsigned but photographed, outlined the arrangement in exchange for facilitating the representation agreement. Sandra would receive a 15% fee on the total estate value transferred. 15% of $3 million. Patricia looked up from the page. She looked sick. The green folder, Dr. Neil Warren. Frank had found 3 prior patients of Warren's who had been assessed for cognitive decline in the past 5 years. 2 had subsequently lost control of their finances to named representatives. 1 family had filed a complaint with the College of Physicians and Surgeons of British Columbia. The complaint was under review. Warren had not disclosed this to new patients. The yellow folder contained something I had not expected. A letter, handwritten, dated 3 weeks ago, addressed to me, never sent. Frank had found it in a search of Moss's office records. A photograph taken by someone inside. I do not know who. The letter was from Daniel. Mom? It began. I don't know if I can go through with this. Sandra says it's the only way to protect the business. That you'll understand eventually. But I keep thinking about what Dad would say. I keep thinking about the way you sat at his desk the day after the funeral and refused to leave. You told me we were going to be all right. I believed you. I don't know how we got here. He had never mailed it. I sat with that letter for a long time. Patricia said nothing. Finally, she said, he may not know everything. I know, I said, but he knows something. Saturday arrived, the way these days always do. Too bright and too ordinary. I dressed in the navy blazer Robert had once said, made me look like someone who had her life together. My granddaughter, Daniel's eldest, came to help me with the flowers at noon. She was 19 and cheerful and had no idea what was about to happen in that community hall. I was careful with her. I laughed at the right moments. I helped arrange centerpieces and thought about Robert and tried to be still inside. At 4 o'clock, Frank called with the final confirmation. Everything was documented. The RCMP Financial Crimes Unit had been briefed. 2 plainclothes officers would attend the event as guests. A third would be positioned near the hall entrance. Patricia would be at table 4. Frank would operate the projector from the back of the room. At 7 o'clock, I would give my speech. The celebration began at 5. 112 guests arrived over the following hour, filling the Maple Ridge Community Hall with noise and warmth. Friends of Daniel's from the business community, neighbors from Lakeshore Road, people who had known Robert, people who had watched Daniel grow up. Sandra had organized the decorations, and they were beautiful. She had excellent taste. I watched her move through the room. She was confident and composed, speaking to everyone, refilling glasses, touching Daniel's arm when she passed him. She looked like a woman who had planned something and was watching it run perfectly. Gareth Moss arrived at 6:15. He was dressed well and moved easily through the room, shaking hands, accepting a glass of wine. He approached me once, smiled broadly, and said I must be so proud of Daniel. I said I was. I watched him find a seat near the far wall. Dr. Warren arrived at 6:30. He sat at table 9. He didn't look at me. Daniel found me before dinner and held me for a moment longer than usual. His face, when he pulled back, was complicated. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for a long time and was beginning to feel the weight of it. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked. "Not entirely," I said, "but I will be." He looked at me as though he understood something and was afraid of it. Then someone called his name from across the room and he turned away. Dinner was served. I ate very little. Patricia caught my eye from table 4 and gave me a small nod. Frank, from the back of the room, lifted one finger. Everything was ready. At 10 minutes to 7, Margaret Ellison dimmed the lights slightly and stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "it is my honor to invite Eleanor Hartwell to say a few words in celebration of her son." I stood. I smoothed my blazer. I walked to the microphone and looked out at the room. I had spent 40 years in this valley. I'd raised a son in this town, buried a husband here, built a business here. I know what it is to trust a place, to trust the people in it. The room settled. I could see Daniel in the front row, his hands folded, his face open. "I have prepared remarks," I said, and I held up a folded piece of paper. "But I'm not going to use them, because something happened this week that I think some of you in this room already know about, and I think the rest of you deserve to know the truth." The room went very still. Sandra's expression changed first. Just slightly. Just enough. I nodded toward the back of the room. Frank turned on the projector. A document appeared on the screen behind me. A corporate registration. 4,771 Okanagan Holdings Limited. Province of Alberta. 2 directors. Gareth Moss. Sandra Hartwell. Gareth Moss set his wine glass down slowly. Sandra stood up. "Eleanor." "What is this? Please sit down." "Sandra." She didn't. She looked at Daniel. Daniel was staring at the screen. "This company," I said, "was created in February of this year. 2 months before Gareth Moss was introduced to me as an estate planning professional at my son's dinner table." I turned to look at Moss directly. "You've done this before, haven't you, Gareth?" It wasn't a question. The next slide appeared the bank transfer records, $212,000. Then the contract, 15%, $3 million. A woman near the back said, "Oh my God," quietly. I looked at the room. Gareth Moss has spent the last 8 months preparing a representation agreement that was intended to be signed tonight. At this celebration, it would have given Daniel and Sandra authority to make all financial decisions on my behalf It would have been based on a fabricated medical assessment that I was experiencing cognitive decline within days. The Morrison-Hartwell Family Trust would have been liquidated and transferred through 4,771 Okanagan holdings to offshore accounts. Moss controls. Daniel was on his feet. Mom? I held up my hand. Let me finish. The next slide appeared. The Manitoba case. The retired school teacher. The RRIF transfers. The long-term care facility. She died. I said. She was 81 years old, and she died in a facility she didn't choose because someone decided her assets were worth more than her autonomy. He looked at that woman the same way he looked at me. I was going to be his third. The room was completely silent now. Even the servers had stopped moving. I clicked to the next slide. Doctor. Warren's name appeared beneath a timeline of the 3 patients Frank had identified. Doctor. Neil Warren has been my family physician for 6 years. He treated me through my husband's death. I trusted him. He prepared a medical assessment documenting my cognitive decline. The dates he cited. I looked at him now. Directly. You know what I'm going to say? Don't you? Neil. Not one of them reflects what actually happened. Warren looked at the table in front of him. His hands were flat on the cloth. My assistant kept records. I said, every meeting, every conversation, every property inspection, documented. Frank, please. The next slide showed a side-by-side Warren's notes versus my verified calendar. The room murmured. Patricia Goldman stood from table 4. Your Honor, she said. And Judge Harold Price, whom I had invited as a guest and who had agreed to be present, rose from table 7 with the gravity of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. The emergency order, Patricia continued, is now in full effect. All accounts under the Morrison-Hartwell Family Trust are frozen. Any representation agreement executed tonight is void in law. Gareth Moss stood and walked toward the exit. One of the plainclothes officers stepped in front of him. Gareth Moss. The officer said, You are under arrest for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse. Moss said nothing. He looked at Sandra with an expression that was almost contemptuous, as if she were an inconvenience. The second officer approached Dr. Warren. Warren rose without resistance. His face had gone the color of old paper. And then I looked at Sandra. Sandra was looking at Daniel. Daniel's face had gone through something I have no word for. He was white. He was absolutely still. He was looking at his wife as though he had never seen her before. And also as though, somewhere in a place he hadn't been willing to look, he had seen this coming for a long time. Sandra, he said. Her name. Nothing else. She turned away from him. I stepped down from the podium. The officers were leading Moss and Warren toward the exit. The room had broken into 100 quiet conversations. Chairs scraping. Glasses set down, half-finished. Margaret Ellison was at the door. Managing everything with the competence of a woman who had run community events for 30 years and seen a great deal. I walked to my son. He was standing with his hands at his sides, looking at the empty chair where Sandra had been. She was being detained near the entrance. He hadn't moved. Danielle, I said. He turned out, and what I saw in his face was not the face of someone who had conspired against me. It was the face of someone who had let something happen that he knew was wrong and had told himself a story about why it was necessary. That is its own kind of betrayal. I want to be honest about that. Did you know? I asked. He closed his eyes. Not all of it. I knew Sandra was working with Moss. She said it was for succession planning. She said it was to protect you from yourself. She said you were showing signs. She said he stopped. Did you believe her? He was quiet for a long time. Part of me wanted to. He said finally, "You've been so focused on the business since Dad died. You wouldn't slow down." I thought maybe she was right. Maybe I wanted an excuse not to fight her on it. I want to be honest about that too. It hurt more than anything Moss had done. Because Moss was a stranger, Daniel was my son. We stood in that hall for a very long time after everyone else had gone. Margaret brought us tea and left us alone. Outside. The Okanagan night had gone cool and clear. And you could hear the lake from the parking lot if you were quiet. I am not here to tell you that everything was repaired in an evening. It was not. Sandra was charged in January. Conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse. Breach of trust. Fraud under the Criminal Code of Canada. Her lawyer entered a not guilty plea. The trial was set for the following autumn. Gareth Moss pleaded guilty in March to 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy. He received 4 years at a federal institution and was ordered to pay restitution of $700,000. The Manitoba family was notified. The civil claim continued. Dr. Warren's case was referred to the College of Physicians and Surgeons. His license was suspended pending investigation. A formal criminal charge for fabricating medical records and conspiracy was added in April. He was the kind of man who had traded his patients' trust for money, and I think he had managed to believe for a long time that he was not doing anything wrong. I do not know how a person gets there. I do not want to understand it. The Morrison Hartwell Family Trust was restructured with Patricia's guidance. I added 3 independent trustees. I updated the representation agreement on my own terms, naming my sister in Victoria and Patricia Okafor as co-decision makers. I added a provision requiring 2 independent cognitive assessments from physicians with no prior relationship to the family, should any question of capacity ever arise. I kept the business. Daniel moved into a short-term rental in Kelowna in February. He and Sandra's separation was quiet. From what I understood, painful in the way all such things are, when you realize you had been living inside someone else's plan. He came to my office every Tuesday morning. We didn't always talk about much. We drank coffee and went over the lease renewals, and he asked questions the way he had when he was young and learning everything from his father. We were not all right yet, but we were trying. In May, he brought me a letter. 2 pages. Handwritten. The kind of thing you write when you have finally stopped defending yourself. He said he had known something was wrong and had chosen not to see it. He said he had been angry at me for a long time. Not for anything I had done, but for being the kind of person who didn't need saving. He said he had let Sandra's narrative take hold because part of him had wanted to believe he was the one who would finally rescue something. He said he understood now what that had cost me. I read it twice. Then I walked outside to the garden, sat in the chair Robert had bought the summer, before he got sick, and stayed there for a very long time. I wrote back a week later. 3 pages. I told Daniel that I had made my own mistakes, that after his father died, I had replaced grief with work and called it strength, that I had been so focused on preserving what Robert built that I had stopped asking what Daniel needed from me, that there was a version of the story in which my absence created the space Sandra had filled. That does not excuse what happened. But I had spent enough years in this valley to know that nothing grows in ground that was never tended. I told him I forgave him. Not because it was easy, because I chose to. He called when he received the letter. We talked for almost an hour. At the end, he said, "I still want to run Hartwell one day. Mom, if you'll let me." I told him we would talk about it. That was not a no. Margaret Ellison and I have lunch at the same cafe on Abbott Street on the last Friday of every month. She orders the same soup. I order the same tea. We don't always talk about what happened. Sometimes we talk about her grandchildren and my garden and the way the lake looks different every season. 11. Near the end of one of those lunches, she asked me if I was angry. I thought about it for a moment. Not the way I expected. I told her, the people who tried to take from me did not know me at all. They saw a woman past 60, a widow, a majority shareholder who had been crying quietly into her paperwork for 4 years. They saw something they thought could be moved out of the way. They were wrong about that. I am still here. Still in the chair at Robert's desk. Still signing the checks. Reviewing the leases. Attending the board meetings. Watching the property values shift with the seasons. The Okanagan is still the most beautiful place I have ever lived. And I have lived here for 40 years. And I intend to live here for as many more as I'm given. If there is anything I want you to carry from this story, it is this: the people who want what you have will always look for the place where you feel uncertain. They will find the moments where you wondered if you were slipping. If you were tired. If you had finally taken on more than you could hold. They will call that place concern. They will call it love. They will call it protection. Don't let them name it for you. You are allowed to be 68 and grieving and occasionally exhausted and still entirely capable of understanding exactly what is being taken from you. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Not your doctor. Not your estate planner. Not even your son. I kept the house on Lakeshore Road. I kept the business. I kept 11 buildings and a commercial block and a family trust that now has better locks on it than it did before. And on a Tuesday morning in June, I sat across from my son at Robert's old desk, and we drank our coffee. And he asked me to explain the clause structure in one of the older lease agreements, and I explained it. And he wrote it down. And outside the window, the lake was the same flat silver. It always is in the early morning. And I thought about Robert. And I thought that some things, if you fight hard enough, if you refuse to be moved, you actually get to keep. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. If something in this story stayed with you, if it made you think about trust, or family, or the things we protect without realizing how much they mean to us, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you know someone who might need to hear a story like this one, please share it with them. I'll be back with another story very soon. Take good care of yourselves.